Thank you for joining Direct Women's webinar on the new normal of global corporate board membership. My name is Kelsey Velma, and I'll be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I am the Program and Marketing Manager here at Direct Women, and I'm excited to be hosting this session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen right now and hear my voice. The phone lines, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. At the top right of your screen is the GoToWebinar panel. Just open the console, type a question, and hit submit. Feel free to submit questions at any time. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 40 minutes of content followed by 15 minutes for Q&A. Our speakers' biographies are available for download in the handout section of the GoToWebinar console. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no more than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I would like to introduce the moderator of today's program, Stephanie Scharf. Stephanie is the founding partner of Scharf Banks Marmor LLC, a prominent women-owned law firm that represents corporate clients on a wide range of complex litigation and corporate matters, and a principal with the Red B Group LLC. She also serves on Direct Women's Board of Directors and co-chairs Direct Women's International Boards Committee. Stephanie, I turn it over to you to introduce Direct Women and our distinguished panelists.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. It's a great pleasure to be here today in another of a series of Direct Women webinars. And Direct Women, of course, has the mission of seeking to increase the representation of women lawyers on corporate boards. We do that by identifying highly qualified women attorneys and helping them to position themselves for service on boards. We have a Direct Women Institute in order to create a pipeline of women legal leaders who can effectively serve in boardrooms. And we also serve as a resource for corporations seeking qualified women board members. Today, it is a great pleasure to welcome 3 very distinguished leaders who are highly experienced women lawyers with international board experience and who are going to speak to us about what it's like to serve on international boards. How does it happen? What does it feel like? What are the experiences? What are the surprises? And how they personally benefited, personally and professionally, from international board service. So our speakers today are Patricia Diaz-Dennis. She is former General Counsel and Senior Vice President, AT&T Inc., and Director of United States Steel Corporation, of Entravision Communications Corporation, and Amalgamated Bank. Suzanne Rich Folsom is Senior Vice President and General Counsel, Philip Morris International Inc., and Director of Equal Future Corp. And Lisa Hook is former CEO, President, and Director of Neustar Inc., Director of Fidelity National Information Services Inc., Partners Group Holding AG, Philip Morris Products SA, Ping Identity Holding Corp., and Unisys Corporation. I'm going to begin by asking each panelist to tell us briefly her professional background and really how it is that they developed an interest in serving on an international corporate board and how each came to be appointed to an international board. Let me start with Lisa.
Gee, thanks. So, nice giggles, Patricia. So my first international board is a company that's now called RELX. At the time was called Reed Elsevier. It has a very bizarre corporate structure. It is basically 2 companies. One is incorporated and traded on the FTSE in London, and the other is incorporated and traded on the Amsterdam Exchange. And they come together, the 2 independently traded companies come together in a subsidiary called Reed Elsevier Corporation, which, as I said, is based both in London and in Amsterdam. I was appointed to the board in 2005. It was my first international board and my third public company board. And to be frank, I wasn't actually looking to join an international board at all, but was called by an executive search firm in New York. Mind you, 2005 was the dark ages. And they were looking for one board member to fulfill multiple roles. They wanted one woman, check. They wanted one person under the age of 50. At the time, I was 46. They wanted somebody from the media and telecom industry, and they wanted an American. And they wanted that all in one director because, God forbid, you have one woman and a different person who's under 50. And so really, there weren't that many women in C-suite positions in media and telecom in the US under the age of 50. I'm sure I was one of a slate of, 4 or 5 candidates, and managed somehow to BS my way through the set of interviews with a group of people, all of whom were in the House of Lords and men in their 70s. It was an interesting board to join culturally because they didn't have other Americans on the board, but the company had about 50% of its revenue in the United States, and all of US lawyers would know it as the owner of LexisNexis. And so it was a fascinating board to join culturally. They were really looking to transform the board at the time as they were migrating all of their businesses from paper-based businesses that were basically purveyors of data to digital businesses purveying workflow solutions. And so really I was the first person in what turned out to be a fairly dramatic shift in the membership of the board. My second board, Philip Morris International, was actually, I was appointed to that board, believe it or not, through the Old Boys Network. One of the members of the board of Reed Elsevier and I became fairly close as board members, really enjoyed serving on a board together. And when he rolled off after his 9-year, as you know, in Europe, there are term limits. He rolled off of Reed Elsevier after 9 years. I was the senior independent at Reed Elsevier, so rolled off after 10 years. And he asked if I would be interested in joining the board of Philip Morris. Very similarly, talked to the folks there, love the transformation that they're going through, and joined that board. And then most recently this spring, Philip Morris is interesting, by the way, because operationally it's based in Lausanne, Switzerland, but it's incorporated in the US and traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And then most recently this spring, I joined the board of Partners Group Holdings, which is the European, is a private asset manager, very similar to a KKR or a Carlyle Group in the United States, and traded on the Swiss exchange. That board actually came through a search firm as well. And I was interested in that, not necessarily because it was based in Europe, but I was looking at a number of publicly traded asset managers, and I just thought the culture of the firm, what they're trying to do, and their value system is in line with what I was looking for. So 3 boards, very different outlooks, but I enjoy the European boards as much as I enjoy the US boards, but for different reasons. And that is, they really take a very different view of the macroeconomic situation globally. I learn more, I have a greater appreciation for cross-border issues, even than I do on the US boards that I'm on that are also global companies, because, Americans, we still behave like an island nation. And so it's really useful to be on European boards and see how companies with dramatically different cultures approach the markets.
Thank you, Lisa. And we're going to get back to a couple of concepts that you discussed in your introduction. Suzanne, what about you? How did you experience, and how did you come to be on the board?
Thanks, Stephanie. First, what I'd like to say, what's unique about this panel for me is that I have one of my connected to my day job, I have one of my current board members here. Lisa's on, as she mentioned, is on the board of Philip Morris International. And I have one of my past, I didn't say old, Patricia, past board members who served on the board of US Steel when I was the general counsel, and then also on the board at the World Bank when I worked there. So anyway, so it's a unique opportunity for me to be with them, and it also shows you what a small world it is. The first public board that I served on was an international board and a Dutch company called Advanced Metallurgical Group. And what's interesting, I went through the Direct Women program and institute, and when I came out of the institute, I ran into a friend on the street in New York, and he said, "What are you in New York?" I told him about Direct Women, and he said, "I was just in Germany and at dinner with a group of CEOs, and they mentioned that they were looking for one of them said, I'm looking for a female board member who's a regulatory attorney, who actually has real international experience, has been boots on ground, abroad, and listed a couple of other things." And he said to me, "I think you check all of the boxes. Can I submit your name?" And I thought, wow, just came out of the institute. This is great. He did. And I was invited to interview. And I've told some people it was a more intense process for this particular board than when I got my top secret security clearance in the US. They grilled me on every country that this company operated in. Thank goodness I had been to every country that they had operated in and I could speak to, but the questions were, and I'm a news junkie, the questions were very intense for this board. They wanted to know what I thought about the political environment in those countries and how it impacted their business. So it's a good thing I watched the news. And anyway, I was asked to serve on that board. But what was really, really interesting, it didn't matter. They were actually happy that I was a lawyer, as opposed to, I think, what women have experienced, when interviewing for many US boards. That was not seen as a negative. But they also were very focused on, did I have true international background? And that was really, really important to the people on the board, that I wasn't, in their minds, a typical American from their perspective. And I'm very happy and proud to be an American, but they wanted to make sure that, as Lisa said before, that I look through the lens perhaps a little bit differently, perhaps a little bit more like they have because of the experiences I've had. So anyway, that was my my first joining of an international board. And now I work for a US company, as Lisa said, but a unique one that's headquartered in Lausanne, and I am sitting in Lausanne right now. And it's very, very happy to be here, be a part of Philip Morris's transformation. So.
Thank you, Suzanne. And I should note that it's 8 p.m. where you are. So thank you for staying with us at the end of the day.
Yeah, no problem.
Patricia, what about you?
Well, I'm a little bit of an outlier. My international board is really quasi-governmental, and we wanted to kind of bring that perspective as well. Although I serve on 3 public boards in the United States, one of them, Entravisión, a Spanish language media company, has offices around the world. And so the fact that I speak Spanish and that I've lived in Chile and Japan, I think was very helpful in obtaining that particular request to go on the board. But my very first experience with something international is a result of Suzanne Folsom. I was on the international delegation for the Third World Women's Conference in Nairobi in 1985. Suzanne was then Chief of Staff to Maureen Reagan. We spent 2 weeks together. There was, I think, 35 delegates. We flew on Air Force Two. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. But Suzanne and I met then. She was much younger than I was. I was on the, in 1985, I was on the National Labor Relations Board. I was a member of the board. I had been a labor lawyer for 10 years before I was appointed to a Democratic seat, Lisa. And anyway, we got to know each other, and it is amazing to me that I get a call from her saying, would you have any interest on going on the sanctions board? It's just being started. It was a new thing, and I think it was what, Suzanne. I can't remember the exact year now. When was it? 2007, I think it was,
No.
that it was started.
2000,
And because I was one of the new members,
2005.
there were 7 members on it. I was the only American. And we reviewed cases of fraud and corruption that had been investigated by the arm of the World Bank in the procurement process primarily. So that was, for me, an extraordinary education because being the only American, you learn how other people approach legal issues. And because in the US, primarily, if it's not prohibited, you say, let's do it. And when we were deciding what kind of remedies to impose and that sort of thing, all the other non-Americans, all 6 of the other people, if it wasn't allowed by the enabling regulations, they said, we can't do it. I mean, it just, amazing how it just turned the whole mindset around. One saying, we can only do it if we're allowed to do it. And me, the only American, saying, well, if we're not prohibited, let's do it. It was a really, really educational process for me because I had to learn how not to be the ugly American and listen, be humble enough to ask questions about what the others would do, and then humble enough to take the advice. So I do think humility matters a lot on any board, whether it's domestic or international. So anyway, that's my first experience, and then I'm now chair of the sanctions panel for the Global Fund, which fights AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis around the world. And that is because of my work on the World Bank. So I still owe Suzanne my thanks for getting me into a sphere I never expected to be in.
So thank you, Patricia. And actually, you've touched on something that I think probably pops up more than once, and that is what types of cultural differences show up in the boardroom. I'm wondering, maybe Suzanne, you could lead off on what your experience has been about cultural differences and whether they matter or not.
Sure, I definitely think it matters. I think that, sometimes Americans speak faster or are more willing to perhaps interrupt a conversation. In certain countries, that's definitely frowned upon. On my Dutch board, nobody interrupted anybody. So you waited your turn, and it was definitely much, at least from my U.S. experiences, both sitting as the general counsel in companies and then also serving on some other boards. That was definitely different. There was certainly more in the Netherlands, more protocol followed, at least for that particular company. I'm not saying it's all companies, but it was much more formal. But there also, the difference was, frankly, I was the second woman to join that board. The first is Austrian. And frankly, I thought that the men listened to the women more on that board than I've observed as a general counsel sitting in US companies. So I thought that was interesting. I'm not quite sure why, but they definitely listened. And I think there was a bit more respect, I saw.
That is interesting. Lisa or Patricia, is there an aspect of cultural differences that struck you when you joined an international board?
Lisa, you want to?
I would say, well, what's interesting on the Philip Morris board in particular is that the board is truly global. So we have board members from China, from Malta, from India. It's a global business. It operates in every permitted country other than the United States. And so I think that the leadership team there has done an extraordinary job at bringing together a truly multinational board, which is fantastic. It is more formal than other boards, but I think it's many cases, the formality is because of the senior leadership positions that the board members have held in other companies. And I'd say the only kind of silly thing that I've noticed over the many years of international boards is that the Dutch tend to be dramatically more direct than Americans. So for instance, on an unnamed board, we had a new board member, female board member, join us a couple of years ago, and one of the Dutch board members said, "You're not nearly as bad looking as you were in your photograph." So, I'm like, that's really not a great, first of all, it's not a great way to welcome somebody to the board. And second of all, that's not, we wouldn't actually say that in the United States. And it's like, well, in the Netherlands, we're really quite direct. Later that evening, the same board member told our new board member, to get in the front seat of the car because her legs were much shorter than everybody else's. So he might have just been, off the reservation generally, but I would say on both on the social side and on the business side, the Dutch board members that I've interacted with over the past 15, 16 years, and I actually enjoy the directness and the lack of politics that they bring to the room, is really quite refreshing compared to some of the US experiences I've had.
So Patricia, you mentioned in your experience that be careful about thinking about American exceptionalism because not everyone agrees with it. Is there another instance of where you saw, gee, this is really different from what I would have expected in the United States?
Well, it's something that Suzanne mentioned, and I think it's really true about how you don't interrupt. And honestly, on my American boards, if somebody's speaking about something and you want to ask a question, they'll say at the outset, questions, just stop me anytime you have a question. If you do that in an international context, generally, it is really verboten. I mean, you're not a good person if you do that. So I found that, and then also just kind of the way things approach. I know some think Texas is a foreign country, but I'll never forget, it just, things, you need to find out what the culture is. I got a call from the CEO. I'd been on the job 3 days, and he said, "I'd like to come visit with you." I thought, what the hell? I mean, what does he mean, visit with me? I had no clue, right? And then eventually I realized that's Texan for meeting, right? So you need to, I think when you're interviewing too, is just, and there's great books, that How to Speak Texan. I know, somebody sent it to me, but I think that's true any country you go to. In Latin America, because Entrevisión does a lot of business there. We have a lot of satellite offices and a lot of employees from there. It really matters if you establish personal relationships first. You don't get right into business. You actually get to know people first before you start discussing business. I think those cultural differences can sink you or allow you to float up above. So I do think it's really important for people to get to know the culture of the country. And then there's obviously a board culture that is overlaid on that. And then there's a corporate culture as well. So I think it's really important for a prospective board member to investigate all three.
Stephanie, can I say one? I just want to say one other thing. I think you have to be very careful when speaking not to always cite to US examples.
Absolutely.
I think Americans, obviously that's, what our primary experience is, but when you're on a multinational, board, and as Lisa said, where it truly is multinational, you want to be careful because, there's lots of other countries that, do good things. And although, we're all proud to be Americans, we can't use that as an example all the time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
If I could.
So let me, no, please do go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to say, I think it's also, as Suzanne and Patricia pointed out, it's, what is the culture of the country or the countries on the board? And then the board culture and the corporate culture But as well, what's been interesting and sort of something to explore when you're looking at going on a board is the laws that govern the markets in that particular country. So, on an American board, one always asks for the insurance policy before going on board. After you check out the liquidity and the balance sheet of the company and health and the reputation, most board members want to see the D&O policy. Things, go wobbly. Is the board protected? Well, interestingly, in Switzerland, obligations of public companies to their shareholders are really quite different. And the Swiss culture is not a culture of litigation at all, as Suzanne can tell you. And so the Swiss regulatory environment, the Swiss political environment, the Swiss legal environment has a huge impact on the issues that one addresses in the boardroom and how one looks at the public markets. And I would say that that's just a massive mind shift for an American public company director to understand and sort of reframe the way you look at issues in the boardroom. And similarly, in the UK, I think we all think it's some kind of like Eastern extension of the United States because they speak some form of English, but UK legal governance over UK traded companies is really quite different from the US, similarly the Netherlands. And so for me, that's the area where when I join a non-US board, I spend a huge amount of time with their law department, with their investor relations department, with their outside auditors, understanding not only kind of international auditing rules, which are quite different to US GAAP, but as well, what is the framework that we're bringing into the boardroom? What are our obligations to shareholders? They're in many cases really phenomenally different than we find in the US.
So that's a very interesting point about really kind of the legal and compliance differences. And I'm wondering if now everyone on this call is a US citizen and sitting on a foreign board or a board of a foreign-based company doesn't remove your citizenship. So what special legal or compliance issues can arise when a US citizen sits on the board of a company that's not based in the US? Have you had experiences like that?
So I can speak to, I think that, we need to, you need to have your antenna up. So for instance, with something like sanctions. So if you're on a European company board, they, even though you did your due diligence ahead of time to make sure that they're not operating in or doing business with any US sanctioned country, that doesn't mean that they might not along the way decide that they want to do business there. So you have to be on top of that because as a US person, that's problematic for you. And it doesn't mean that you can just step out of the room, when they're having a conversation. So that's not necessarily on either the management's radar screen, if none of them are Americans there, or the other board members. So you have to make sure that you continually check to see and ask questions about that. You can't just rely upon the due diligence that you did, at the beginning. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Good answer.
Let me pick up. So let me pick up on something Lisa and Suzanne also mentioned before, and that is they talked about how they came to be on an international board. And Lisa, you mentioned search firms, but Suzanne, basically you had a personal networking experience. So I'm wondering, and let me start with Patricia and then move to Suzanne and Lisa. I'm wondering, what do you think is the best way for a US-based woman lawyer to position herself to serve on an international board?
The first thing, and I think too few people do this, why do you want to go on it? You have to have a quick and ready answer, and it's not money. For me, I want to make a difference. I care about getting more women and people of color on boards. So I like the fact that board members review succession plans, for example. That is what has kept me doing this work, even in this horrid time of COVID, and being on a computer all day has created COVID brain in me. It's really difficult. But what I think, one, you've got to decide for yourself and have a ready and quick answer. That positions you. I'm very curious too. I love learning how, how steel is made or how a bank runs. And there's a heavy regulatory overlay in banks, and, who are the regulators, that kind of thing. You have to have curiosity, but cast as wide a net as possible. Every single position, including all my day jobs as well as my boards, have come from serendipity, getting to know someone, and that person then, Suzanne with the World Bank. My first board appointment was because I was, NLRB appointment rather, was because there was a colleague at the law firm. I was the first woman and only woman at this law firm for a while. And he was a new associate. I felt sorry for him. He was scruffy. I used to invite him for dinner. He recommended me to the National Labor Relations Board because he had gone to law school with somebody who's now on the Fifth Circuit. I mean, it's just a very serendipity world. And so you need to be kind to everybody. I tell people kindness really matters. And go to as many things. I'd get very active in the World Affairs Council, wherever you are, because you're going to meet a lot of people who've been in business and care about the world writ large. And so there's organizations. For me, it's the World Affairs Council. I'm still very active in it. I'm the chair of the San Antonio one. I would do that. If you're really interested in international issues and going on an international board, I'd find out what are the organizations that have a lot of people who've either currently in business or been in business, because you never know who's going to recommend you, as long as they think you're competent and kind. That's my advice.
Good advice. Suzanne, Lisa, anything to follow up?
So I would say it's really critical to have international experience. If you are if you're geographically bound, you don't have any kind of hook, if you will, in your resume that shows that you have an appreciation for global issues, you're just not going to be considered. I do think that many, whether it's search firms or companies directly, don't believe there is any such thing as American exceptionalism, except that we are exceptionally parochial. And so having that international background is key. Before I was appointed to the board of Reed Elsevier, I started and built Time Warner International, and so spent 2 years outside the United States buying and building businesses around the world. And prior to that, when I was younger, I had lived, believe it or not, on the Arctic Circle, on a reindeer farm for a year. And so, I was able to sort of understand living outside the United States. As I said, had done so, had built businesses outside the United States in several countries. And that really makes a difference. So whether you can accept an appointment to work outside the United States, or join the Council on Foreign Relations, or if you're in a law firm, find those international clients to represent, some touch points to being able to say, I know and understand what it's like to run a business or to work outside the United States is absolutely critical. And frankly, without that, I don't think that there's an opportunity for I also think that it is more difficult to serve on an international board of any size. It's the same thing as in the United States. The toughest board to get is your first public board. And after that, you're, in theory, a seasoned director, and life changes pretty dramatically. But I would say that that's probably even more the case for many international companies. Now, I will tell you that the Nordics the Sweden, Norway, and Finland, those companies tend to have dramatically more meetings every year, are really focused on getting women. And so seasoned female directors who have a lot of different choices tend not to look at the Nordics. And there are many people who tend not to look at UK boards for similar reasons. So UK and the Nordic countries may be a little bit more of an opportunity for somebody without prior public board experience, but you definitely need the international experience.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with what Lisa just said. And, you can't decide, no matter how successful you've been in your career, at the age of 50, 55, whatever, wouldn't it be nice to go have board meetings in Paris? And your only maybe international experience to that point was you went to the Bahamas. That's really not going to cut it. I'm sorry.
What about St. Bart's? They're French speaking.
But I would argue that you have to really start thinking earlier in your career, and you have to be a risk taker. And I feel incredibly blessed for the different international experiences that I've had throughout my career, but it's because I was willing to take risks. I went and worked in the Middle East for another government. I went and did this work in Africa, the trip that, Patricia talked about, and other work there. I worked in other countries, lived in other countries. And you have to be willing to do that. And, along the way in companies, the US companies where I've been the general counsel, I've tried to create opportunities for the lawyers to do secondments, even for shorter periods of time. And frankly, I'm really surprised at how few have been willing to take me up on the offer, even when, I arranged it so somebody could do a 3-month secondment somewhere during the summer when their kids would be out of school, and I think you have to be willing to be a risk taker to get that experience. They want people that have been boots on ground there. And the more experience you have, I think the more, marketable for a board later on in life. I do also think, how the world looks at the US and just watching, things happen the past couple of months. And having some conversations with people about, Americans on non-US boards. I think that it's going to be even maybe a little bit harder in the sense that they're going to be really looking to make sure that the American that they invite to be on the board is really more of a person with a global perspective and not just, as Lisa said, not just a parochial perspective.
One of the things that we learn through Direct Women programs is, and you've all mentioned this, the importance of business and maybe even personal networks. And that at least for US boards, for putting women lawyers on boards, the personal networks seem to matter much more often than search firms. But are search firms important for becoming a member of a company, of an internationally based company based outside the US, a board member? Lisa.
Can I just represent all of the introverts that may be watching this? Because every time, I'm a massive introvert, and every time I go to a seminar and they tell me to build a massive network, I hang up and I start crying. And so I'm just here to say even introverts who are terrible networkers can actually get on boards. That's my advertisement for introverts. But it is, and it's, I don't think networking is necessarily walking into a crowded room and talking to a lot of people that you've never met before. But certainly being curious about the people that you meet, as you're walking through the business world, and asking them about themselves and understanding what they're doing. As you progress in your career, you will naturally meet a number of people who are on both public boards and private equity boards. And I think as you're doing that and asking how they got onto the board and showing your interest, as Suzanne said, you just run into people, and if you say, I'm interested in joining a board, tell me how you did it, people, to Patricia's point, if you're kind and you listen to people, all of them love to talk about themselves, you're naturally going to build that network through business associations that will lead to your first board. But I think it's both asking about other people. You'll naturally run into people who are on boards, asking them how they got onto a board, asking them to mentor you. Once somebody's invested in your career and mentoring you, they'll want to put you on a board because that's what makes them a successful mentor. But it doesn't mean you have to go to a lot of cocktail parties.
I think it also, though,
Patricia and I were on the phone earlier today. She's extraordinary. She can light up a room. She has charisma for days, and she's a massive introvert, extrovert. And I literally just walk into a room like a little brown mouse in her shadow. But I'm just here to tell you that, little mice can do it too.
Thank you for that.
Suzanne,
Lisa.
did you want to make
No,
a, Suzanne, did you want to comment?
yeah, I think it's, I'm really not a big fan of networking because I think it's actually relationship building. And so
Yeah.
even for Patricia, who does light up a room and you connect with her immediately, but also with Lisa, who describes herself as the little mouse there. I mean, they've both spent their careers building relationships, and so have I, and that makes a difference. But I think you do. Even the person that I ran into on the street exiting the Direct Women Institute, when I said I'm interested in serving on a board, he said, "You have time for that?" And this is somebody who is my friend, who's been my friend, at that point was my friend for over 30 years, who has been a big sponsor and mentor of mine. But he didn't think of me when he was at dinner in Germany. It wasn't until I said to him, I'm interested. So I think even for the people that know your supporters, you have to let them know because they might not think of you or might not have thought of you in that light before. So, and people are busy. People are busy. You have to refresh people's memory.
That's really good advice. So let me switch gears a little bit. Let's say you've been tapped on the shoulder. You have an interview to join an international board. How do you prepare for a board interview?
I would say you prepare for a board interview of an international company in the same way that you prepare for a board interview in any company or frankly any interview, and that is, at least I spend a fair amount of time with my best friend Google and read about the person, watch any of the YouTube interviews that they've done, know about them, and honestly, if you can, find out interesting personal facts about them that you can relate to. It's really like, as Suzanne said, relationship building. Sort of what do you and that person have in common that you can weave into the relationship so that it's not just a formal interview, but you really get to know the person, what their thoughts are around the company, what their thoughts are for the future of the company, how the board dynamic is working. But all of that comes down to how do you build that kind of personal bridge initially, whether you went to the same law school or you like the same soccer team or your grandparents grew up in the town that they're from. There's always something, whether it's domestic or international, that you can find to bridge that stranger gap in an interview. And then, I look at all the sell side reports. I talk to other people in the business. I've got, thankfully, a number of friends on Wall Street. So what's the reputation of the company in whatever market they're traded in? I read the proxy statements. So, just coming with sort of having done your homework on the company and on the individual, I think shows the seriousness of your interest. And from reading those materials and then putting them away for a day and thinking about it, you'll come out with 4 to 6 hopefully insightful questions to ask that show that you've done your homework, that show that you're interested, that show that you can, as an attorney, sort through massive amounts of information and come down to the 1, 2, 4 questions that are relevant to the future of the company.
Well said.
Anyone else?
She said it all, really.
So let me follow up with this. We've been talking before about kind of culture, US versus culture of other of other countries. But what about board culture? Is the culture of the board important? And how do you find out about that in a board interview or in discussions with board members?
One thing, and Lisa and I talked recently, I said, one thing I've learned the hard way is I don't want to go on a board where there's primarily CEOs, because there is groupthink. They're truly groupthink, and diversity, I don't care what color they are, what gender they are, there's groupthink about CEOs, and it's led us, I think, into sort of perilous times in some ways. So I do think the culture thing is so critical because, who was it? Peter Drucker said, culture trumps strategy every time, and it can be toxic. And what you really want is where speaking truth to power is encouraged and cherished, because in a kind way. You don't want to, say things in an ugly way in the boardroom. It's just not appropriate. But I do think that asking just directly, how would you describe in your interviews? Tell me how you describe your culture. And I also think it's important to talk to other board members to see what description from the whoever, whoever your first screeners are, because you're going to go through screeners, and then eventually you get asked to think about going on the board. And I always ask to speak to other board members because you hope you get truth. And if there's a consistency, you've got some truth. But really, I also ask them, how do you describe the tone at the top, which is so critical anywhere. I don't care whether it's American or Scandinavian or whatever. Tone at the top is really critical. So I ask board members, how do you describe it? And then how would you describe the culture of the boardroom? What are the dynamics? I just ask and see if there's any consistency. And if not, then you've got some issues. And you may want to do it anyway, but it makes it a tougher decision. So, because fit is really critical. Also, it's not just your skill set that people are looking for. They're also looking to see whether you fit with that group of people. And that is a much more, as Lisa said, emotional intelligence. Not a lot of men necessarily have that. I think women have it better. I mean, the reason for term limits is because men are uncomfortable having unpleasant conversations. I really have come to believe it. They like something that's automatic and elegant, and they don't have to have an unpleasant conversation with somebody. I've served on a board where we had unpleasant conversations. Much better, because then you didn't waste 2 years, 10 years, whatever it is, waiting for the person who isn't contributing to go off the board. Anyway, so that's my 2 cents. Suzanne, you're looking incredulous there.
No. I'm just thinking about some of the boards you've been on.
Yeah.
Suzanne and Lisa, what kinds of questions would you want to ask in a board interview, and what would you want to find out?
I think many of the same things as Patricia, because from the outside in, you can decide whether you like the company's mission and strategy. You can, from the outside in, you can, for the most part, figure out whether they have a good management team or not. And so it really comes down to, as Patricia said, the board culture. But for me, it's also a question of fit with the CEO, right? Because you have both a role inside the boardroom, and then you also have a personal relationship with the CEO. And it's, how well do I get along with this person? Is this the type of person that I can call up and just say, I'm uncomfortable with this? Will this person call me and use me as a resource or a mentor or as a partner. And if it's a board, which is, there's no issue with this kind of board, but if it's a board for me where the board members show up 5 times a year and you participate in board meetings 5 times a year and then you go away, again, there are many boards like that, and that's completely fine. I just prefer to be on boards where I have more involvement with the CEO and with the C-suite and feel like I can do some small part in terms of pushing shareholder value creation forward. Now, again, many boards are not like that. Many CEOs don't want that kind of input from their boards. So it's really a personal choice about what you're looking for. But for me, that's important.
I think it's also important to ask to speak to 1 or 2 of the executives that haven't been offered up to you. You know, typically you'll speak to the CEO, the CFO, maybe the general counsel, maybe not. But if you don't, I'd ask to speak to the general counsel. But I would also, if there's only 1 woman in the C-suite and she's not one of those positions, I'd ask to speak to her. I mean, I think you're going to get, well, I guess it depends on how comfortable the people feel answering your questions, but you can get a sense from their responses. So I think that if you're really, which you should be, being selective about what you go on, you know, and not all boards are created equal, as both Lisa and Patricia have just said, and you want to make sure it's the right board for you to be on. I think it's important to speak to some of the management.
I think it's also, if I could just expand on that, I always talk to the general counsel, the CFO, the CEO, and whether it's the chief people officer, the head of HR, or whatever, because it's really less what the head of HR says than it is how they behave and what their reporting relationship is to the CEO. So if you're looking at the board, and again, there's nothing wrong with this, it's a personal choice. I tend to look at going on the boards of companies where talent really matters, as it does, for instance, in technology. But there are many companies where the talent is not that important. The physical assets are important. So historically, for instance, manufacturing, you know, the assets are in the ground. Wireline telephony, the assets are in the ground. And so people matter less than assets. If you're looking at going into a company where the asset is the human beings, I think it's really critical to talk to the head of HR, chief people officer, whatever title that company is giving the role.
So let me ask you this. Many women lawyers are on boards of not-for-profits, and some are on private corporate boards, companies that are not public companies. Does being on a not-for-profit board prepare you to be on a public board, or is it like apples and oranges?
Well, I chaired Girl Scouts of the USA for 3 years. I was on the board for 9. It certainly prepared me, I think, because you learn again because there's stylistically people approach making decisions. And I think the more exposure you have to different styles and culture, also culture, it just prepares you to deal with it in a professional and good way. It certainly educated me. So I think it's important, and you never know who you're going to meet on a particular nonprofit. And I honestly think it's incumbent on us to try to bring as many people along with you as you can, and you meet great people who you can in turn recommend for other positions. But that I think it depends on the nonprofit, obviously, but I overall I think it is helpful. It's not going to make or break you necessarily, but you just might meet somebody who gets you into that first job. The first one that Lisa was saying is true. After you're on the first one, it's easier after that.
I think it's important also, Stephanie, not I think any experience is good, but I also think serving on the boards of startups. And I have, I think I've learned more from my startup boards than I have in other situations. And, you know, board members are obviously more involved, you know, you know, I've had some great experiences and really learned industries. I sit on the board of one now. It's a fintech company, and it's been fantastic for me. I was on the board startup company of another e-commerce, and so just learning about those businesses and really learning. You know, I mean, I've worked for old line companies. I you know, hadn't worked for tech companies, but my startups have been tech companies, and so that exposed me to a whole new world. So I would highly recommend if you have that opportunity to serve on those types of boards as well.
Yeah. If I could, to that end, you know, private equity firms historically only appointed their own partners and employees to their boards. And over the past 5 years, there's been a dramatic shift among all private equity sponsors to bring what they call operating partners onto their boards. And so I would completely agree with what Suzanne said, whether it's a startup or, you know, there are a number of private equity owned companies that are several billions of dollars in revenues. Only 10% of the market, the capital market, is actually public. So there's a massive and growing opportunity to go on private equity boards, which are interesting. You know, you spend a lot less time on governance because they only have one shareholder. And so I would explore those opportunities as well as public boards, just because if you look at, excuse me, the number of public companies today, you know, even 10 years ago, there were something like 11,000 public companies. Today, there are approximately 6,000 public companies, and there's an even greater push for companies to go private. So the number of public company boards is obviously not vanishingly small, but becoming less and less, while the private equity market opportunities are growing exponentially.
Thank you. I see that Kelsey has joined us. Did you want, do you have any questions that you wanted to ask?
Yes, so somehow we're nearing the end of our hour, and we do have a couple of questions from our attendees. So this first one that came in, I think, is drawing on something that you said earlier, Suzanne. This person wants to know if any of our panelists have a source or a recommendation of a source for international news that you think has a more global and balanced perspective on what's going on outside of the US. They kind of noted that, you know, many of the US news sources have a pretty tilted view, so they were interested in any recommendations our panelists might have.
So I think you have to read the Financial Times every day, not just because of the color of the newspaper and how polite they are. Take a radically different view. You can always get the beginning, which for me at least has been a calming influence over the past couple of months. Asia Daily News is pretty good, and The Economist.
The Economist.
It's really interesting living here in Switzerland, just the different news perspective that I had forgotten since it had been a couple of years since I lived outside the US last time. But when you turn off the CNN and the Fox News and you're looking at the stations over here, it definitely, they look through a different lens. So that's been very interesting for me to watch. And I flip through all the channels. I don't stick on one. I look at as many as possible as I can.
Great. Well, I have 1:59 p.m. Central, so I think that's probably the only question that we have time for. I will hand it back over to you, Stephanie.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you really, Patricia, Suzanne, Lisa, for spending time with us and being so candid and informative to all of us. I hope that our listeners join us again for an upcoming Howard Chat with Direct Women honoree Paula Boggs, who is a former general counsel and has joined the arts most recently. And that webinar is entitled Leaving the Legalese Behind, Lawyers as Corporate Board Candidates, and that's in January. Please do take a few minutes to give us feedback. I think there's a very brief survey that launches automatically at the end of the program, and we can use it to get your comments and to build future programs. Again, thank you very much to all. Farewell, stay healthy, stay safe. Thank you.